Hi friends, this is Selvijang here. Welcome to my networking channel. Hope all are doing good. And today the topic I'm going to discuss about how to configure IP version 6 OSPF in Fortigate firewall. So OSPF is for version 4 and I'm going to show you how to configure IPv6 OSPF in Fortigate firewall. Okay. So the first and foremost thing we have to configure the directly connected interfaces with the IPv6 address. So in this architecture, I have connected three FortiGate firewall. So the firewall 1 and 2 are connected by physical port, that is port 1, and firewall 2 and 3 are connected by physical port 2. Okay, so these two interfaces in the same subnet 2001:111, and these two interfaces are in a different subnet. Okay, 2002:111. Okay, so first let us configure the interfaces, then I will be configuring a policy. So why? Because in case of FortiGate firewall, so we have to allow a policy for a communication from port 1 to port 2 and from port 2 to this port 1. Okay, so that policy I'm going to configure in this particular firewall, middle firewall, that is FortiGate firewall 2, for the allowing the communication between these two different subnets. So the two things are mandatory. First I have to going to configure a policy, then I will be configuring the OSPF version 6 for OSPF IP version 6. Okay, so these are things I am going to configure today. So to make the job easier, what I have done, I have added a notepad file, so we can use this for configuring the interfaces and the policies. So that will make our work more and more easier. So what is the command for configuring interfaces? You already know. So the command is config system interface edit port 1 config IP version 6. Since it's configuring IP version 6 followed by this IP version 6 address. So the command is set IP6 address 2001:111/64. Then we have to allow the ping access. Okay, so since I'm going to configure for port 1, so let us copy this entire configuration and let us paste it on the first firewall. Okay, so we are done with the configuration. Show system interface port 1. So this will show the configuration what we did, and let us do a ping to this particular directly connected address. So I'm able to ping. Similar way for the second firewall has two connected interfaces, port 1 and port 2. So let us configure using this particular script, right? So port 1 and the address is, only thing I have to change this address to 2. Okay, so just copy it and paste it on the second firewall. Okay, and then we have to configure the second port with this particular subnet. Subnet is 2002:111:1. Okay, so this is for port 2. Copy, I hope you are following this, and paste it. Okay, so now let us view the first and the second port. So system interface port 1. So this is a configuration we did. Okay, and for port 2 this is 2002. Okay, it's different subnet. So similar scenario I am going to configure for port 3 with this particular IP version 6 address. So port 3 is again port 2, 2002:111, last is 2. So now copy this and paste it on the last firewall. So now we are done with the interface configuration. Okay, so now what we can do, let us do a ping from this firewall 3 to this remote interface and firewall 1 to the remote interface. Okay, so let us go to firewall 3, execute ping 6 followed by this remote interface. So I'm able to reach the remote interface. Similar way, let us go to the first firewall and let us ping this interface. Okay, so the command is execute ping 6 followed by the remote interface address 2. So I'm able to reach. Okay, so first we have done with the interface configuration command. Second thing, let us configure the policy for this port 1 to port 2. So I have to create two new rules. One rule is for allowing from port 1 to port 2 and the second is for port 2 to port 1. So this is a policy I will return. So this is a policy we have to configure for config firewall policy. Okay, policy 6. Why? Because since it's an IP version 6, edit 1 is nothing but I'm making a first entry. Then the source interface is port 1 and the destination interface is port 2. Source address we can make a specifically address or you can give all. So I'm giving set source address as all, destination address as all, schedule also I'm giving it as always, and the service we want to give only specific service like ICMP or POP, any service I can give. Here I have given as all service, then the action should be accept. Okay, So this is my first firewall policy, first rule. Just copy it and paste it on the firewall 2. Okay, so just paste it. Now save the configuration. So this is for port 1 to port 2. Now let us add a second rule for port 2 to port 1. So what are the modification I have to do is edit 2. That is, I'm making a second entry. Source interface is port 2 and the destination is port 1. So the remaining all the parameters remains the same. Okay. So now copy it and paste it on the second firewall. So now we are done with the policy configuration. Show firewall policy 6. It will show the what are the policies. It will show the two policy. So the first policy for allowing from port 1 to port 2 and the second policy is for port 2 to port 1. So we have done with the policy configuration. So now the third configuration is pending is we have to configure a OSPF version 6 for identifying the remote networks. Okay, so how to do that? Prior to that, let us ping the remote interface. Execute ping 6 2002 colon 111 colon 1. So still is showing network unreachable. That means I have to configure enable OSPF version 6 on firewall 1, 2 and 3. These three firewalls I have to enable the OSPF version 6. Okay, so the command is config router. Okay, OSP version 6. Then we have to set the router ID. So I'm setting the router ID as 1.1.1. Then what we have to do is we have to configure an area. So always OSPF, whether it is in version 4 or version 6, we have to configure the area in a backbone area. So this in this particular architecture, all these routers I am going to configure in the backbone area, that is area 0. For that the command is config area 0. Okay, config area, then edit 0.0.0.0, then I have to end the configuration. Okay, so now what I have to do is now I have to go to the network statement and config OSPF interface I have to add. Okay, so the command is config OSPF version 6 interface, then the command is edit 1. Okay, then we have to set the address. Which address is set interface? You have to set interface. So the OSPF version 6 I am enabling on this particular interface, that is port 1. Port 1. Okay, now let us save the configuration. So now let us view the configuration. Show router OSPF 6. So this is the only thing we have to do is first you have to configure the router OSPF version 6, set the router ID, then I configure the area and the backbone area. Then one more thing I added is I have enabled the OSPF version 6 on this corresponding interface, that is port 1. We added this. Okay, so we are done with the first configuration. So now let us go to the second firewall and let us enable it. So go to the second firewall. So config router OSPF version 6. Okay, then the command is config. We have to set the router ID, right? So set the router ID as 2.2.2. Then we have to config area. Area I'm going to configure in a backbone area. So 0.0.0.0. Then just do end. And now I'm going to configure the enabling this particular OSPF version 6 on this particular interface, port 1 and also port 2. Okay, so config OSPF version 6 interface, edit 1 and set the interface as port 1. Okay, now do next. Okay, next interface is edit 2. This is a second statement. So it's second entry, set interface port 2. Okay, so the first interface, so config OSP version 6 I'm enabling on, since it has two directly interfaces, port 1 and port 2. I have to enable the OSP version 6 on both these interfaces. That is the only thing I'm doing. Just now save the configuration. So now let us view it. Show router OSP version 6. It will show the configuration. Router ID is 2.2.2. Area is a backbone area. OSP version 6 interface I enabled on port 1 and port 2. So edit 1 is nothing but I'm making a first entry. Edit 2 is for making a second entry, that is port 2. Okay. So now let us go to the third firewall. So third firewall has only one connected interface, that is port 2. So that is the only configuration pending, right? We have to enable the OSPF version 6. So go to config router OSPF version 6. Okay, set the router ID as 3.3.3, then config the backbone area config area edit 0.0.0.0, then come out of this end, then config OSPF version 6 interface. I'm enabling on port 2. Okay, so edit 1, set interface port 1, port 2, sorry, right, port 2. Then let us save the configuration. So what are things we have done is we have enabled the interfaces and we have configured the two policies from port 1 to port 2 and port 2 to port 1. Then we enable the OSP version 6 on all these things. So OSP version 6, what are things I have done is we have set the router ID. Then what we have done is we have enabled it in a backbone area. Then I enabled the OSP version 6 on this corresponding interface. That's the only thing we have done. So now the first and foremost thing, we have to check the OSPF neighbor relationship. How to check is get router info 6. Since it is for IP version 6, we have to do info 6, then OSPF neighbor. So they are already seeing the neighbor is already up. It is already established a full neighbor relationship. So now let us go to the second firewall. So get router info 6, okay, and OSPF neighbor. So that also it is showing the neighbor ID. It is already established. So now let us go to the third firewall. Get router OSPF, get router info 6, okay, OSPF neighbor. So you're able to see. So for checking the routing entries, what you have to do is get router OSPF version 6 info 6 OSPF route. That's the only thing. So now you are able to see, right? So the directly connected interface is this one, and it has already successfully learned the remote networks. You are able to see that is the purpose of enabling OSPF version 6. So execute ping 6 followed by the remote network. Let us ping the remote network. So I'm able to reach the remote network. Let us also ping the second end. So this interface I'm pinging to that also I'm able to ping. And now let us go to the second firewall. So get router OSPF, get router info 6 OSPF route. You are able to see these are only two directly connected networks. So now let us see the third firewall. It should learn this particular remote network also. Okay, so get router info 6 OSPF, okay, route. That's a command. So it already learned the remote networks via this OSPF. Okay, so execute. So this is nothing but a link local address via port 2 and the area is backbone area. So execute ping 6 and the corresponding OSPF network. So I'm able to reach the remote network also. Okay. And also there's another command you can check is get router info 6 routing table. You can check via this also. It will show the corresponding routing table. So it is directly connected interface and the OSPF learned routes and the corresponding AD administrative distance also it is showing, right, 110. Similar way, let us go to the third firewall. So there are two commands you can check. Either you can do get router info 6 OSPF neighbor, or you can simply do get router info 6 routing table. It will show the routing table and the OSPF remote networks learned via OSPF version 6, right? So this is how you can configure the IP version 6 OSPF in case of Fortigate firewall. So what are things we have done is first we have configured the directly connected interfaces with the IP version 6 address. Then we have configured two policy for allowing port 1 to port 2 and port 2 to port 1 communication. So and the third thing is we have to configure the enable the OSP version 6 on all these three firewall. So these two things are mandatory. So assume if you are configuring only OSP version 6 and if you are not configuring policy, so you can't ping the remote network. So these two things are mandatory as per Fortigate is concerned. And also I hope you enjoy this video. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe for more videos. Thanks and have a wonderful day. Thank you.